Mary redeemed a $50,000 cash prize playing Chumba Casino this year.
I was only playing for fun, so winning this was a dream come true.
Chumba Casino is America's #1 social casino experience. It's serious fun. With over 80 casino-style games to choose from, you too could win life-changing amounts of cash. Be like Mary. Log on to ChumbaCasino.com and give them a whirl. That's ChumbaCasino.com. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details. The voice in the preceding commercial was not the actual voice of a winner.
Hello, and welcome to the Proactive Caregiving Podcast. As a CPA with over 20 years as an industry accountant, Jessica stepped away from the corporate world to become a full-time caregiver for her mother. Having learned invaluable lessons along the way, she is now here to share those with you and to invite you to join her on this caregiver's journey. Here is your host, Jessica Cannon.
Hello, everybody. I am the Proactive Caregiver, and I specialize in educating others on how to be proactive by empowering you, the caregiver. Because if you cannot take care of yourself, then you cannot take care of your loved one. And part of taking care of yourself is communication between self-talk and how we communicate with our loved ones. So today I wanted to talk to you about caregiver communication, what happens when it breaks down along our journey, and how we can possibly improve on it. Communication, to me, the way I've experienced on the professional side of it, is definitely something that's either going to make or break a business or relationship. But no matter how well we articulate or however well we think we are speaking and trying to get our points across to others, no matter how well it sounds to us, it's still up to the other person to receive our message and interpret it. That's where a lot of this, you can see, falls apart when we're dealing with our loved ones and caring for them who are living with dementia. Some people living with dementia are going to relive past experiences, and regardless what that kind of traumatic or upsetting event it may be, they may reach that point where they're reliving and experiencing something that you don't realize that's what's happening. So your level of communication, which may sound clear to you, may actually be something that's triggering them. This happens both for us as family caregivers and as the professional caregivers step in. So our words spoken, implied, or even demonstrated through body language makes an incredible difference for helping to diffuse situations or even just having a pleasant moment, because it is going to determine whether or not they react in a positive way to us or negative. That is why today I wanted to have my guest on. She just recently wrote a book, and it is Essential Strategies for the Dementia Caregiver, Learning to Pace Yourself. Got all my notes going here. This is going to be an amazing time for us because if I'm experiencing this, I know many of you are as well. So my next guest, Tami Anastasia, is going to join me. She's a dementia consultant, an educator, and speaker. She has provided counseling services, dementia guidance, emotional support, and care strategies for families and the professional caregiver. I asked Tami to come on to help shed some light on improving communication, as she shares in her book, because it's hard enough to care for our loved ones as they decline through the stages of dementia, but even harder for the caregivers in memory care communities who have limited interaction with our loved ones. So we need some guidance here, and who better to do this with us today than Tami Anastasia? Thanks for coming on with me today, Tami.
Jessica, thank you for inviting me and having me.
Absolutely. So I'm curious, with your book and the way you have described everything through it, I was wondering if you could kind of give us some insight how dementia began to touch your life. How did you come into contact with dementia?
So many years ago, my grandmother was diagnosed with, back then, they called it senility. And
Ah.
they thought it was from the iron of when she cooked in the pots and the pans.
Right.
Back then, that's what they thought. It was leaking out into the food and she had senility. Fast forward 25 years. And quite frankly, at this time, no doubt it was Alzheimer's, but
Mhm.
we didn't know that then.
Right.
And I wish I knew then what I know now. So, having experienced it with my grandmother, who lived with it for almost 27 years,
Wow.
it was brutal. And I couldn't explain it to my dad. It broke my father up and could see his mother just deteriorate. So now I thought I do so many support groups. I have a private practice where I work with caregivers one on one, and a lot of the same things keep reoccurring, and the caregiver gets exhausted
Yes.
and they're overwhelmed. And I thought we need to teach people how to pace themselves through this journey. So I have firsthand experience with my grandmother, but most of this really evolved from the caregivers in my private practice and in my
Mm.
support groups.
Interesting. So that is something that I didn't realize I wasn't doing early on, being able to pace myself, because it
Yeah,
seemed like we would have the lulls that we are just getting by day. And then eventually there's either emergency or something drastically different that it was, oh no, emergency, get into this mode of how quickly can we fix this? What do we have to change? And so
right.
that is something that I really appreciate that you go into in the book as well. So, can you explain to me what the PACE acronym is for?
Yeah. So the purpose of the book is to hold the caregiver's hand through the day they get a diagnosis, their loved one gets a diagnosis, all the way till end of life. And so PACE, the whole point of the book was to teach caregivers how to conserve their energy. So I came up with
Mm.
the acronym PACE, how to pace yourself. And the P stands for give yourselves permission for trial and error. This journey is a long journey and there's a lot of ups and downs. And a lot of times figuring out what's going to work or why something's not working is to learn from mistakes.
Right.
And caregivers get so upset with themselves because it's so challenging. And
Mhm.
their needs are the loved ones' needs with dementia change
Oh, yes.
quickly, rapidly.
Mhm.
And so we can't always figure out what the needs are, but we may be able to figure out by learning from what doesn't work.
Right.
So it's to give caregivers permission
Mhm.
to trial and error, make mistakes. Mistakes are not failures. Mistakes are opportunities to learn from.
Mhm.
And I think of the dementia journey as learning by doing,
Right.
truly learning by doing. It's the hands-on, it's the immediate what's working, what's not working. And if I learn from what's not working, I might be able to figure this out better without being judgmental, without being critical of yourself.
Mhm.
And P also stands for patience, right? And I really
Yes.
truly feel patience is a skill we develop. A lot of us
Absolutely.
aren't born into this world just with a lot of patience. And so we learn patience by learning from the process and
Mhm.
then providing structure. People with dementia need structure. They need to be able to
Yes.
have some sort of sequence to their day. Doesn't have to be rigid, but there's enough sequence to the day that they know kind of what to expect when. And what do I mean by that? I think we have body memory. And
Mhm.
so when I get up in the morning, I have a certain routine. In the afternoon, I have a certain routine. And in the
Right.
evening, I have a certain routine. So the A stands for acknowledge their reality.
Mm.
Here's what happens. Dementia is a brain disorder. It is a brain
Mhm.
disease. Brain cells are deteriorating. What that does to the brain is that it alters reality.
Right.
So the person with dementia is going to have an altered reality. And often they may blame you for things, accuse you of things. They may say things that are incorrect. They may say things that are embarrassing.
Mhm.
We don't know how to deal with that. So I teach in the book, in the A part of the acronym, it's all about how to enter their reality, how to communicate in their reality. And it talks about how the brain changes them cognitively, behaviorally, socially. and physically, how they're affected. And then I give you the skills on how to deal with that. And then the C stands for compassionate care.
Nice.
Not only compassionate care towards your loved one,
Mm-hmm.
but compassionate care towards yourself.
Exactly.
Caregiver guilt is huge.
Oh,
And
yes.
so many caregivers have this judgmental, critical voice, and you're going to
Yes.
have a lot of feelings, right? This
Right.
journey is taxing, and it can be meaningful, and it can be compassionate. Another reason why I wrote this book is how to make this journey as loving, compassionate,
Mhm.
kind, supportive as possible. But that also means with yourself.
True.
So I talk about ways to deal with caregiver guilt, how to deal with the anger, the resentment that you may build up, the frustration, the sadness, the loss. It's such a range of emotions that caregivers go through. So I
Mhm.
wanted to equip the caregiver on how to deal with those emotions. But more importantly, I also wanted to normalize it.
Right.
These are normal feelings.
Right.
And then the E stands for empowering yourself. And this part of the book talks about educating yourself in terms of what your triggers are, educating
Mhm.
yourself in terms of what your loved one's triggers are. And then I also walk you down in terms of what to anticipate throughout this journey. And I prepare you for it. So in there, I talk about when to hire home care, when to place your loved one into a care community, when to bring in hospice. But more importantly, I also talk about the questions you should ask and the answers you should receive. So the E part talks about educating, but also I'm lining up your ducks. I'm preparing you as to what's coming down the pike, and you have these resources, you have the questions in your hands, you know what the answers are. And so I walk you through that process, and again, try to prepare you as much as possible in terms of what this journey looks like all the way to end of life.
That's excellent, because starting my journey in the beginning, not having any idea where it was heading, it made
Yes.
it at first, it made it somewhat easy when I was able to get to the next plateau and the next plateau. And it was a somewhat slow transition. But then when the journey gets a little bit further along and the
Yes.
plateaus start dropping faster, and I have no idea where this is heading, or I started to begin to have an inkling of where it was heading. And so that panic and anxiety starts to settle in, it gets to be a little bit harder to decide, okay, how do I move forward without completely losing myself in this process?
That's right. That's exactly right. As you know, statistically, the caregivers, a lot of caregivers pass away before their loved one
Yes,
does because of the stress and the demands and the
absolutely.
responsibilities and the challenges the caregiver deals with. And that was the other thing. So many times the doctor gives the diagnosis and they say, okay, your loved one has Alzheimer's, your loved one has Lewy body dementia, your loved one has vascular dementia. You
Right,
walk out the door, and now what?
right.
And that's why I wanted to provide this book, but I also wanted to hold your hand throughout the whole journey. And one of the best things you can do early on is to educate yourself as much as possible
Yes.
about what dementia does to the brain, how it's going to change your loved one. And I wanted to provide that resource for people.
And this is an excellent resource, because the more I went down my journey, the more I realized this is going to be care for her and care for me. This is
Yeah.
going to be, I didn't realize it until later down though, when the communication between moms started to break down. This is going
Yeah.
to be very challenging if I'm going to be able to be effective in my caregiving and not be frustrated all the time.
Yeah.
So this resource is excellent, because it's that handbook that you can have with you, and maybe not have it every moment of the day, but you may go along your journey and have something that comes up that you can go back and touch up and say, okay, what was that question I was supposed to ask? How was I supposed to approach the situation, and so on.
Right. And I spent a lot of time with the book knowing that my audience is going to people who are stressed out,
Yes.
who don't have a lot of time.
Mhm.
So it is a book that you don't necessarily have to read from beginning to end unless you've got the
Right.
time to do it. but that you can open up the table of contents and go exactly to the
chapter you
section
need.
that applies to you in that moment, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And so, and the other thing I did is, if I don't know if you noticed, but I also made it larger font and
Mhm.
a lot of spacing so that it was easy to read. I mean, easy to read physically might be difficult to absorb when you're in the midst of it.
Right.
But I really spent a lot of time thinking, I want this to be a useful tool that is easy, it's applicable, and they can digest it quickly without having to fish through figuring out where and what's going to apply to me when, and it's
Right.
right there for you.
Well, and that's why I really like this section for today, because it's not only applicable to the dementia caregiver. When you think about how communication affects so many different relationships in so many different ways,
Yeah.
and the better we get to be with our approach towards communication and connecting with our loved ones, then we kind of know how to communicate with them better, which hopefully smooths the journey a little bit more and has a little bit less of those flare-ups. They're going to be flare-ups regardless, but
Yeah.
hopefully at this point with communication, it makes it a little bit more smoother.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. So I do a lot webinars on how to dementia friendly communication tips, outside of the book. And so I get emails from colleagues and people who've attended the webinars, and they'll often say, we could apply these strategies to people even who don't have dementia, right?
Yes, exactly.
And I said, yeah, they're great strategies regardless,
Exactly. Which
Yeah.
is helpful because I think the growing epidemic that dementia is becoming,
Yes.
these are just resources that we need regardless.
Yes.
If you have experienced it with your grandmother, I'm experiencing it now with my mother.
Yes.
And so as people go along, and as a sandwich generation, now I'm that parent that's caring
Yep.
for one, but also being a parent, I don't want to pass down these not so great habits. I don't want to say the poor habits, negative habits, but I don't want to pass it down to my children and improve that communication now, because this is one of the areas that I actually am struggling with my own mother at this point in time in our journey.
Okay.
So communication, the anger and aggression
Mm-hmm.
that was coming out, being able to know where it's coming from and how to respond and react
Yes.
is the difference between aggravating the situation further
Yes.
and actually getting control of something and understanding and being able to help her feel like she's heard, she's understood, she's
Yes.
appreciated, and our relationship stays on a nice even keel and not have these spikes of emotional bouts that we were starting to have.
Yes.
So when we, in relation to our loved ones and trying to help improve that communication,
Mm-hmm.
how should we approach this as the family caregiver communicating first off, before we even go to the professional side?
Sure. So it's a great question. It's a loaded question. So let me
Yes.
try to break it
Break it
down
down.
into segments.
Of course.
So when we're dealing with people with dementia, we have to adapt. We have to adapt to the changing brain. We have to adapt to the changing needs, and we have to adapt to the changing behaviors. So what that involves is the family caregiver has to deal with these changes, loss, have to deal with the sadness, that this person is no longer the same person that they could have that relationship with. And we have pre-dementia, what was the relationship like? And then we have dementia, and now what the relationship is like. So one of the most important things to keep in mind as a family caregiver and or as a professional caregiver is you want to know as much personal history about your loved one as possible. Because when this brain changes, as you mentioned earlier, they may relive past experiences as though they're happening today.
Exactly.
And so we have to have this understanding, and the more information we have, the better. That being said, you always need to know their behaviors are ways of communicating.
Mhm.
As this disease progresses, they lose the ability to communicate clearly and communicate what the need is. So behavior becomes a way they communicate a feeling and a need. And
Mhm.
so they may not cooperate, or they may not do what you want them to do because they can't process the information. They don't
Right.
understand what you're asking of them.
Mhm.
So here's this fine line between having this relationship with your loved one pre-dementia and now
Mhm.
dementia changes them.
Right.
And I'm often asked, how do I get my loved one to cooperate? You know, are they trying to manipulate me,
Yeah.
or are they just refusing? And when you get a diagnosis of dementia, I always say now we default everything to dementia.
Mm.
What they used to do prior to dementia and what they do during dementia, the default always goes towards they are behaving, they are saying and doing these things because dementia is causing it. And
Mm.
if you can make that distinction right off the bat,
Sure.
it's going to allow you to not take things so personal, right?
Yes.
And you're doing everything in your power to care for them, to support them, and you want to help them, and then they're refusing your help or they're resisting your help. And you have to understand that often that resistance, that anger, or that aggression is because something's not right.
Mhm.
Either I can't process what you're saying, or I don't like how you're approaching me, or I feel very fearful, I feel threatened, I feel scared. And so what are we going to do? We're going to react. And so here again, keep in mind that every behavior is sending a message of some sort of a need.
Yes.
And there's basic needs. So the needs might be they need reassurance and support. They may need to feel safe and secure. You know, when they're asking you all the time, when can I go home? When can I go
Mhm.
home? When I can go home?
Right.
We take it literally. But what that really means symbolically is that the home they're in now, or the place they're in, even if it's their own home or they're in a care community, it's an unfamiliar home because the home they may be referencing is a home that was 50 years ago,
Right.
might be 40 years ago. So, metaphorically, when they communicate that, what they're communicating is I need to feel safe, I need to feel secure, or I need to see something that's familiar.
Mm.
And so we have to pay attention to what the needs are. Other needs are they need physical care. They may need to go to the restroom. They
Mhm.
may need to be the center of attention. You know, there's a lot of needs. They may be sharing things with you that are memorable. So keep in mind, what are they trying to communicate? What is the need? They need to feel validated and heard. We
Right.
all need to feel validated and heard,
Absolutely.
right? And
Yes.
so when we don't feel validated and heard, even when we don't have dementia, we don't like it. Well,
Yes.
imagine I'm communicating to you, and even though it might be incorrect, even though I'm blaming you for something you didn't do, they believe what their mind tells them.
Yes.
So we have to find ways to communicate with them and meet them where they are. We have to enter their world and try to understand their perspective and
Mhm.
how that brain now has an altered reality. Much easier said than done,
Right.
because you have your reality, and now we got to figure out ways to juggle both realities, their reality and
Mhm.
your reality, and find that fine line.
And sometimes that fine line feels uncomfortable because I know when I tried that in the early stages before I was able to make that mental head switch of pre dementia and now this is dementia, feeling
Yes,
comfortable with entering mom's world. And
yes,
sometimes that entering the world was I need to make sure I'm tethered to the outside world so I
yes,
don't get so far in that I lose sense of my reality. And I know that sounds weird to say that, but there were times that I would specifically ask questions or start a conversation that was just random and just to get conversation coming from her so that I can kind of gauge where is your mind?
That's right.
What age is your mind in?
Yes.
What time period are we dealing with? So then I could
Yes.
react and have other conversations with her, because otherwise our conversations ended up being about the weather. And that gets
Yes.
very boring, very old, very fast.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the best things we do with people with dementia is what we call reminiscing therapy, and reminisce about things that you did that were fun and things they have shared with you before in their past. But I will tell you, if we listen, we have to really put aside our own agenda.
Yes.
But if we really, really, really listen, and they're talking about a home 40 years ago, that's where their brain is right now. They
Right.
think they're 20 years old. They think
Yes.
they're 25 years old. They think they're in college. And that's what we have to do. We really have to listen to what they tell us,
Mhm.
because that's going to help us gauge where their brain is living and what era, like you said, what era are they in? What's resonating with them? Now, that being said, if we don't know a person's past and they have some trauma,
Mhm.
physical abuse, sexually violated, abandonment issues, or rejection, those things may come to the surface. And when we have that information, we're going to know how to comfort them. But if we tell them, oh no, don't worry about it, they're going to ruminate on it, right?
Right.
They'll start going over and over and over, and that's going to happen anyway. But we
Mhm.
want to prepare you on how to deal with those things. And if we know the past history, it's going to help us know how to manage their behaviors.
And that, I'm so glad you explained it that way, because this is a perfect way to transition the communication from the family caregiver to the assisted living. Because this is something where I've experienced with my own mother, that I understand. I had to start asking those questions and figuring out some of that reminiscent therapy, as you spoke about, because if I didn't know where she was at, then I may say something that offended her. I may say something that hurt her, or something that triggered her and created a very unpleasant situation to get through right at breakfast. The first thing at the beginning of the day could possibly be, and then the rest of the day is a struggle to get through until we can go to bed and reset for the next day. But stepping into the care community with assisted living, now it's a transition where I've done the work with mom, but they're having to pick up where I left off, and she's much further down than with me when I had the years of her decline, and now they're coming in the end stage. And so it is difficult for them to understand. And maybe that reminiscent therapy for them looks different, and maybe they don't even know to do that at all. So communication is really broken.
Yeah,
Or
so
can be.
it can be, right? And some of that could be the training that they've had or haven't had. And in my book, I talk about the questions to ask when you interview a care community. So let me ask you this, Jessica, really quick. Since you've read my book,
Yes.
what would you do differently now that that would make you feel better about choosing a care community? Or what would you do differently? Like, what do you wish you would have known then
Oh,
that
yes.
you know now?
The questions of knowing what to ask are
Uh-huh.
very big, because when you enter a community, when I first started, and mom is in her second community, because not knowing enough information the first time around, not knowing what
Yeah.
to ask, made the difference. When I entered a community, what happens, and I think the industry depends on this type of reaction, is you get oohed and ahs of,
Yeah.
this place looks like a hotel. It's fabulous. It's wonderful. And
Beautiful.
it's all about how it looks
Yeah.
and feels from entering in the very first, walking in through the front doors, and not so much about the care and how things are done and why things are done and when things are done. And if something doesn't work, how are they going to work with my loved one in remedying something? Or do I get that call that's, mom's been called to the principal's office, and we have a situation that needs something more, either more information for me, or it needs more than just information. And so that's the key of knowing before you step into that care, because having to learn the hard way, okay, this place that looked good on the outside
Yeah.
and sounded good when they listed the meals, their cafeteria or lunch, dinner, dining room, or the activities director, and these are the activities we do. When later down the road, it was like, well, it all sounded good, but it really didn't match up with the needs that mom had. And so knowing that and learning it the hard way, I had some more questions that knowing what to ask when I went to the next place to see what are more specific questions to ask for her and the style of care she would receive for her needs. Because we say dementia, but there are still different forms of dementia. And so someone with Alzheimer's may need different form of care than someone like my mother who has a mixed form, which includes the frontal temporal and vascular. And so there's the behaviors, the moods, the level of cognitive functioning, it all kind of varies, very similar, but it varies just enough that if you don't know what questions to ask, then it's hard to find the place that is good for your loved one, that actually works more specific for them.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we all have to keep in mind in a care community, not in a care community, is dementia affects everybody differently, right? Yes. And yes, we see certain patterns, we see certain things, we see certain signs and symptoms and things like that. But still, our loved one is just as unique as anybody else. And I think that's the other thing I caution is don't compare yourself and your situation with anybody else, because you could have 30 residents. Every single one of them is different. And I think that's where it comes down to. Some people call it person-centered. I call it meet them where they're at. But again, it's really getting to know the person. And the more the families can share about their person, about their loved one, here again, collecting a personal history, not just a history of, how old they are and where they've lived, but really a personal history. As much as possible, the information you share is going to help them know how to interact with your mother or your loved one, and have this background, because then we may bring things into the care community that will resonate with them, that will bring them comfort, that will make them feel secure and make them feel safe, and they'll have the reassurance they're looking for and that familiarity, right? So, but you brought up a wonderful point, in that is we do get caught up in the bells and whistles, right? You walk into a stunning, gorgeous place and we forget, wait a minute, it could be gorgeous, it could be outstanding, it could be beautiful, but I want to know more about how you care for people, your residents. I want to know what are challenging behaviors and how do you deal with those? I want to know how do you deal with someone who needs to be pacing all the time, or someone who gets very angry or upset. How do we diffuse that? How do we manage these residents, and bless the care community's hearts for being able to provide care for them? But I think we just go one step further and they're inundated. They've got 30 residents, 20 residents, whatever, and they're trying to manage all of this. And I think it's coming down to just some bare basic skill set. But it's not basic skill set. It's basic skill set for the dementia person is very different. We need to know how to change, as I said earlier, how to change with that changing brain. How do we change when their needs change? How do we adapt to the behaviors that change? And what are some skills, and get them to tell us, how do they deal with these things? There's not an issue when things are going great. There's not an issue when the care is fantastic, which 90% of the time, 95% of the time, care can be fantastic. But how do we deal with these changing needs? How equipped are you? How do you approach it? How do you diffuse it? What things do you have in place as a care community to make this easier and better for the residents
Right.
as well as for your staff.
Right. And those are excellent questions to ask because unfortunately, that first interaction you have might be with the marketing director, not necessarily the person or the people, the team that would be actually working with your loved one on a regular basis. And so asking those questions and having those answers in advance it helps you prepare for your loved one. It helps because that was something that as I started to look into these communities before actually transitioning mom into one, I was able to find out what their routines were and so that I could mimic that at home. So shower days, meal times, just so that it wasn't too much of a change in routine when she went to the new place. But knowing how she reacted with me at home and trying to relay that information, this is how she responds to this and this is how she responds to that, and not to be all inclusive, it was difficult. And now when we're in this level of post-COVID, in this community, caregivers were hit hard, like a lot of our nurses and doctors and hospitals, that everyone is hit hard. And so the amount of caregivers that are out there available for communities to draw from has shrunken, unfortunately. And so getting people in who are trained and understand what dementia is a challenge now.
Yep. Yeah, that's one of the worst parts about COVID, right? At the isolation and the loneliness, but also what happened to the caregivers. And then the families couldn't come in and distract them. I mean, all of it fell on these caregivers, and they're working double shifts, right? They're working every day to try to just manage all of this. And here again, we have still the training. And one of the questions you always want to ask is, what kind of training do they provide for their caregivers? And do they do it in person? Well, not now with COVID, a lot of it's going to be webinars or whatever, but you want specific training done. You want a minimum of so many, 2 or 3 trainings a year for a couple hours, so that you have a really good solid foundation. And it just can't be that you watched a webinar for an hour and then, okay, we call it, it's okay,
they're
that's
trained.
the training.
Yeah.
And so, we talk about the family caregiver has to take care of themselves, but so does the professional caregiver have to take care of themselves. And some other questions you want to ask is, what would get your loved one kicked out of a care community? A lot of times you want to know that answer. And are they skillful, and can they manage your loved one? And if they can't, better to know that now than to get too deep into it. And then we'll find another care community, because truly these care communities really, really, really are doing everything they can to take care of your loved one. But it's hard, when it's your loved one, or even when it's a private client of mine, and I go in and I see things and I'm like, okay, I got to bring it to their attention. But I also know they too are really trying to do the best that they can. However, and I will say this for myself, I can never not have enough education. I always can learn something.
Absolutely.
I can always learn something new. I can always better my skill set. And I think that's what we have to be open to, is that we have caregivers who want to learn, who want to be educated, who don't have all the answers, and we can always learn from one another. So I think that's key too, is how open are the care communities to providing that education, and are the caregivers willing to get more education?
True.
And I don't ever think I have all the answers. I can always learn something from somebody, and I'm always open to that, and also open to the idea that maybe my approach or my thinking may not be the best, but let me see what I can learn from other input, right?
Exactly.
So I think that we just have to be open to learning and not assume we have all the answers, because we don't.
And that's where that gives that opportunity for communication to break down. When we
Yep.
try and make that assumption that we know what we need to know and we don't need to look into or learn anything new, then things start to break down and it causes problems across the board
Yeah.
when communication breaks down.
Yeah. I'm going to say this. I think this is true regardless if we're dealing with dementia or not. We don't listen enough.
Yes.
We need to listen more, and people will shut down but we also we'll shut down if we feel attacked. We'll shut down if we feel defensive. And so how do we communicate in a way, I truly believe, with people with dementia, we have to still be respectful of one another. We have to be respectful of our differences. We have to be respectful of where each party's coming from and how do we find a middle ground. In my opinion, the family caregivers know a lot about their loved one. We need to hear what you tell us. We need to hear what you're sharing with us.
Right.
We need to hear what your concerns are. We need to hear what your frustrations are. And likewise, take that information and say, okay, how do I utilize this information to make this best case scenario for all parties involved? You have something to teach me. Maybe I have something to teach you. How do we collectively make this a better situation? Because in the end, the person that suffers is going to be the person with dementia, is going to be the family caregiver and or the care community. And yet
Absolutely.
our goal as a family caregiver and a care community is to provide the very best care for the loved one with dementia.
Right.
So I think we have to put aside a preconceived agenda. We have to be more open to understanding how dementia changes so many dynamics.
Absolutely.
And we have to be open to listening to what the families tell us. And if I talk too much, then I know I'm not listening well. I need to listen more, talk less, and then interject where I feel it would be important information to share.
Well, and in some cases, sometimes talking less means you're observing more.
Right.
That was something I always felt in the beginning. I felt uncomfortable with the silence in the room. And I was trying to fill that silence with talk, questions that she just, enough with the questions already. You know, I can only bug her so much. But eventually that communication is also observing and watching and seeing how they are throughout the day to improve. Then you learn the questions. Oh, so you would prefer to sit on the left side of the dining room instead of the right side because they prefer the window versus the seat with the plant that's next to someone that they don't care to be next to, or, you know, just observations of their behavior is better or more or less in one area of the facility in different ways, different times of the day, but it's observing those situations and then getting those questions. And what I'm experiencing now is even the communication within the staff, the caregivers being able to ask each other. So I noticed you were able to get so-and-so to get in the shower. How did you do that?
Yes.
I noticed you got her to take medication. How did you do that? I noticed he was giving a hard time of eating his meal, but you got him to eat. How did you do that? To share the knowledge so that they learn from each other in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, let's talk a little more about communication. Right now, everything we're talking about is verbal, but there's a lot of communication nonverbal. You know, we could sit side by side with our loved one and be quiet and sit side by side, hold their hand, rub their arm, say, I love you. And we can communicate and express an enormous amount of love, not in our nonverbal. And I think that's the other thing, like you said, you know, silence. A lot of people don't like sitting in silence because it's too nerve-wracking.
Right.
But silence and our nonverbals are just as powerful as our verbal. So I think we have to think, and especially with people with dementia, they are ultra sensitive to our body language. our facial expressions, our tone of voice. And my thinking about that is when the brain is unable to process information, I'm going to cling on to the person who takes care of me, and I'm going to gauge how things are going based on your facial expressions, based on your tone of voice.
Right.
And so if you're raising your tone of voice, it's going to make me a little anxious. You're making me a little nervous. You're making me a little angry. And I think we forget that our nonverbal communication is, especially as dementia progresses, almost becomes more important than the words, because they're monitoring us.
Right.
They're gauging reality based on our reaction. And if you ever want to get a person with dementia upset, try rushing them.
Oh, yes.
You cannot
Yes.
rush a person with dementia. And we have to be respectful of that, right? So I think in terms of communication, we've got to think in terms of verbal as well as our nonverbal. What are we communicating to them? And they can change on a dime based on our tone of voice, based on our facial expression. Now, this all being said, there is no such thing as perfect.
Oh,
you
no.
are not to blame if your loved one gets upset. You are not at fault. We're just bringing things to your attention to consider when you're taking care of somebody with dementia, because I really want to go on record. None of us expects you to be perfect. There is no such thing as being perfect. And you also need to know, you brought up anger and aggression. A lot of times too, it could be a medical condition. They could be in pain. It's not necessarily always something you're doing.
Right.
It could be a way of communicating, again, a need that they can't verbalize, that we need to explore and look into.
Which is why I feel that the observation is, as the progression happens and the stages continue to, your loved one declines, that's where the observation becomes very crucial, to be able to see their difference of behavior, their facial expressions, how they're, the words that they're able to communicate, because that is yet another thing that's happening with my mother now, is that as she's continuing to decline in stage 6 and she's feeling discomfort and sometimes even pain, whether it's from constipation or kidneys, she is more angry and more aggressive. Instead of saying, I don't feel good, it comes out with the, oh, leave me alone, just go away. No, I don't want to take a shower. I don't want to get up. I don't want to eat. I don't want to have to go to the dining room. I don't want my food. Leave me alone. And that, to a staff member or caregiver, professional caregiver, who is not feeling comfortable or very well trained to understand what that is, may just see that person as being, oh, they're grumpy today.
That's right.
They're having a bad day today. I'm going to avoid them because they are not as easy to deal with, versus saying, they're grumpier today than they were the last 2 days. Something's different. I wonder what happened that's going on. And then the questions kick in. What's happening?
Yeah.
How do you feel? What do you feel? Oh, my back hurts, or my side hurts, or my belly's aching. Oh, okay. So that communication. Now we're having to be in that position of breaking a code. Reading body language to break a code.
Elaborate on that. What do you mean by breaking a code?
Breaking a code as in, this is, instead of her words being used. So instead of her saying, my back hurts, I'm tired, I didn't sleep good, my belly aching.
Yes.
When she's pushing food away, something that I know she enjoys, there's a message in there.
That's correct.
There is something that's read between the lines to decipher. Correct. If she doesn't want to get up to get in the shower, she doesn't want to get up to go to the dining room, I've had to kind of, let me fix your covers, let me fix your blankets and pillows just to make sure you're comfortable. And as I go to move them, I see, oh, she doesn't want to get up because she doesn't want me to see she's soiled her bottoms.
Yeah.
So there is something that has to be deciphered with a very different dramatic change. Well, I don't want to say dramatic, because sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's
subtle.
They've been sweet, they've been nice, they've been doing really good, they're enjoying, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere, and we all have our bad days. But when they as they're declining, those bad days get to be a little bit more pronounced. And so
Correct.
we have to actually become that detective to break the code. That's kind of what I was going with.
Well said, exactly. And that is it, right? We have to stop and say, what might be going on? Because there are a lot of medical issues that could
Right.
mimic dementia, right?
Yes.
And UTIs, urinary tract
Oh,
infections.
gosh, yes.
Horrible, horrible, horrible,
Absolutely.
right? Dehydration,
Mhm.
vitamin B12 deficiency, a thyroid. And here again, we want to rule out a medical condition being a problem. But remember, their behaviors communicate something.
Right.
And we've got to pay attention to what their behaviors are communicating. Now, if they're in the earlier phases of dementia, they could communicate something.
Mhm.
When they're in the later stages of dementia, the verbal goes, and we have to pay attention to the behaviors. And the
Exactly.
behaviors are a message to us that we need to pay attention to.
Right.
We need to be attentive to what that's saying. So that being said, I will share a horrible situation where one of my clients, their mother always would go out and would mingle. And then one day the mother didn't feel like getting up. She wouldn't get out of bed. Day 2 goes by, wouldn't get up and wouldn't get out of bed. Day 3, and the physician comes by, and lo and behold, this woman had fallen and had broken a hip, and no one knew that.
Ah,
So right there, this woman
yes.
is staying in bed,
Right.
and she's not going out. She doesn't want to eat. Again, we've got to allow those behaviors to communicate something to us. And you're right,
Yes.
we are the detectives because they can't communicate to us. Now, I shared an extreme situation,
Yes.
but that again still tells you when we see a shift in the behavior, we've got to kind of pay attention to, well, what could be going on, and become that detective.
Absolutely. So this topic today of poor communication actually doubles over because we have so much more detail to get into. So before we go into next week's episode, I wanted to be able to let the listeners know, where do we find your book? How can they find your information if they're seeking your book as a resource?
Yeah, so my book you can find on Amazon, and you can also order it off of my website, which would be www.tamianastasia.com, TamiAnastasia. So it's available on Amazon, or like I said, you could order it through my website. And if you go to my website, you see the other services I provide, the private counseling that I provide, the support groups and things like that. There's a lot of blogs, there's webinars, educational webinars, interviews like this that are also there.
Fabulous. So I am going to say thank you for sharing your time with me today, because I know this conversation is going to continue. There's far more areas for us to go into when it comes to poor communication and how to improve that. So thank you for being here today. And I want everybody to stay tuned, because Tami and I are going to go into more information on how poor communication manifests in other areas of our dementia caregiver journey. So for now, thank you for joining in. I hope this gave you so much more food for thought. And if you're looking for more information, you can also go onto the blog. The links that Tami mentioned will be there for you. And until next time, be proactive, everybody. Take care.
Thank you for joining us today. We really hope you've enjoyed this episode. To learn more about proactive caregiving and to hear other episodes of this podcast, please visit www.jessicalazelcannon.com. This podcast is produced by Cannon Light Media, LLC, www.cannonlightmedia.com. Music provided by Chris Paradise.
Mary redeemed a $50,000 cash prize playing Chumba Casino this year.
I was only playing for fun, so winning this was a dream come true.
Chumba Casino is America's #1 social casino experience. It's serious fun. With over 80 casino-style games to choose from, you too could win life-changing amounts of cash. Be like Mary. Log on to ChumbaCasino.com and give them a whirl. That's ChumbaCasino.com. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
The voice in the preceding commercial was not the actual voice of a winner.